Right, in this video we're going to have a discussion around the Nintendo Switch 2, whether or not I think it will outside the original Nintendo Switch line of systems, and how I sort of think Nintendo can go forward to try and meet that mark, and basically just have a discussion about this topic. So if you guys are interested in this sort of stuff, make sure you like, you subscribe, all that stuff. We're going to get into this. Make sure you grab yourself a nice drink and whatnot. We're going to have a discussion. So let's start with the obvious fact. The Switch 2 is out to a very strong start. Within its first year on the market, it's sold 19.86 million units. It's still not hit a full year yet. It will hit a full year on June 5th, 2026. Now, between June 5th, 2025 and March 31st, 2026, they sold 19.86 million consoles, which was above expectations. They were expecting about 19 million. They passed that, and that is good. That is a good thing for them, that they have actually reached that target. Now, the comparisons people are making is obviously, will it ever outsell the Switch 1? Well, we've got to obviously factor in the fact the Switch 1 is still on the market. It is still receiving games. It is still supported by Nintendo. So the main thing you got to think about here is, if Nintendo was to say gut the support for Switch 1, you shut down Switch Online on Switch 1, then yeah, I think they could potentially get a load more people to buy a Switch 2, but also I think the outrage around that would be quite a big deal. A lot of people would be very annoyed at them for gutting that support so soon after Switch 2 launched. Now, something we have to factor in as well when we're talking about the Switch 1 versus Switch 2 sales and whether the Switch 2 could ever pass Switch 1 is the fact that essentially no Nintendo console has outsold its predecessor. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when Nintendo makes a direct sequel to a system, which they've only done 3 times by my logic, by my understanding, they've only done it 3 times with the Wii to Wii U, Game Boy to Game Boy Advance, and the whole DS to 3DS, none of them came anywhere close. Game Boy Advance still about 30 million sales difference between the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance line of systems. The DS and 3DS, DS sold 154 million consoles, and until recently was one of the most, was actually the second best-selling game console of all time. Obviously, the Switch 1 has surpassed it. But, the 3DS sold 75 million consoles, and then you had the Wii to Wii U, and my God, comparing the Wii to Wii U sales is like comparing Elon Musk's bank account to that of the guy on the street begging for money outside of McDonald's. It's not really a fair comparison. There's no one cared. Although I will say, the Wii U did outsell Sweden, so that is a very, very, very big plus for the Wii U. But I digress. The main thing we want to talk about is the Switch and Switch 2. Now, the main draw that Nintendo needs for the Switch 2 to be successful is games. Now, I will argue, and I've argued for the last about year, that the Switch 2 has got a strong lineup of first-party games. You will see a lot of creators complaining that there is no 3D Mario, there is no big level Zelda game yet, there is no, new, like, Pokemon, but that's coming next year. The next gen Pokemon is confirmed for 2027. It is what it is. And people will obviously argue what game they think is worth playing, what game they think is worth spending the money on. They may not think certain games are worth certain prices, and that's why Nintendo has actually lowered prices on the eShop for games that they're also selling physically. The physical copies will obviously be more expensive than the digital copies, but that's also just a good way to really convince people to buy a game, and not just a game, but a system, because the games are cheaper on the system. Now, I do think with obviously all the content carrying over, so like your Switch 1 games will work on Switch 2. I think that will inspire some people eventually to join up and obviously buy a Switch 2. But I also think the price increase that's going to happen in September may affect the possibility of a Switch 2, outside the Switch 1. Now, obviously, the price increase is going up by $50 or $50 in the equivalent of local currencies to everyone watching the video. But essentially, with that price going up, a lot of people may not afford to be able to buy a Switch 2. Now, sure, the price increase is not as bad as obviously the PS5 or the Xbox Series X price increases, but it's still something we have to factor in when thinking about the sales numbers and whether or not the Switch 2 will ever surpass Switch 1. Personally, if I'm being 100% honest and 100% truthful, I do not see a way, as of right now, that the Switch 2 will surpass the Switch 1 in sales. Now, obviously, the Switch 1 had 7-8 years on the market to prove it was a system that people wanted. It was a new thing. It was a hot new thing when it came out, and everyone wanted a Switch because it could play your games on the TV and on, obviously, the go. Now, I do think the idea of that's going to be lost a little bit, because a lot of people were complaining when the Switch 2 came out that it didn't innovate enough, right? There wasn't enough difference. And I think for a lot of people, that is a point, because when you look at the Switch 2, it is essentially just a more powerful Switch 1, but isn't every console just a more powerful console from the one before? I mean, the Wii is literally a souped-up GameCube. The Wii U was a more powerful Wii. the Switch was a more powerful Wii U. Well, actually, the Switch and Wii U are actually completely different storylines, really. But when you look down at a lot of stuff, like the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Advance was just a more powerful Game Boy. That's all it was. And that's the thing with most consoles. Most consoles are just more powerful versions of the one before it. So really, if you're looking at sales numbers, it really depends on how many people are really willing to switch from their system they already have to the new console, and if there are any games that are willing to make them switch over, If there's any games that come out on the Switch 2 this year that might convince my best friend who has a Nintendo Switch but has no reason to buy a Switch 2, if any games come out this year that he's interested in, he might buy one. However, I don't see it likely, as the only series he buys from Nintendo is Pokemon. So until the 2027, like Pokemon Winds and Waves comes out, I don't see him doing it. I don't see him buying a Switch 2. And that goes for a lot of people. A lot of people don't either have the money or they don't really want it because they already have a Switch that's still supported and they already have, there's no aims for the Switch 2 that have really appealed to them as of yet. That's not me saying there is no games for the Switch 2. I think the Switch 2 does have quite a good roster of first-party games, Donkey Kong Bonanza, Mario Kart World, Kirby Air Riders, and I do think that they've had a strong start. Now, I do think they can continue that growth, but like I said, the whole price increase is going to make things a bit harder. The idea that the Switch 1 is still getting support might negatively affect the Switch 2 as of the next year or so, but I do think eventually a lot of people who want a Switch 2 will eventually buy a Switch 2. I don't think this is a Wii U situation where people are going to be confused on what it is. We all know what the Switch 2 is. The Switch 2 has been very obviously marketed as being the next step in the Switch lifespan, and basically this is just how things are. When it comes to products, Nintendo doesn't have the same cult Apple has, where everyone rushes out and buys a new iPhone every year. They need to justify the reason on why you should purchase it. You don't just hit add an extra button to, the device and suddenly, oh yeah, there's $1,000 extra. With Nintendo, they have to showcase with software and games why it's worth, picking one up. Now, I do think the whole movie, the movies that they've been doing, the Mario movie and the Mario Galaxy movie, and obviously the Zelda movie, which comes out next year, I do think those those films might justify many people buying a Switch 2 who may not already have one. And that is because they will obviously be experiencing these stories on the big screen, and they may think, oh, okay, I actually want to play that. And then they obviously will go and either pick up a Switch or they'll pick up a Switch 2. They might get pushed to buy a Switch 2 by people who work at GameStop or whatever, because obviously, as you know, when a new console comes out and it's more expensive, obviously the stores will get a bigger cut if they can just say, hey, why don't you buy this Switch 2 from us instead of buying a Switch 1? And I do think that is something that we have to factor in. The movies, obviously, and the success of those movies is going to be studied because, it's going to push a lot of people towards a Nintendo product if they're good and if people enjoy them. And obviously, it really depends on how people think about these movies, but also Nintendo has the lucky advantage that a lot of their games are family-friendly and can appeal to a wide audience, meaning that families are more likely to buy their kids a Switch 2 than they are a PS5 or an Xbox Series X, especially at the prices, because $500 for a Switch 2 is nothing compared to, $600 for $700 for a PS5. And really, that's the main thing you'll factor in: the price, the software, and the other brands and the games and the IPs enough for people to check out. And obviously, we need to factor in third-party support. If third-party support for Switch 2 dips and no one's supporting it with brand new games besides Nintendo themselves, that's something else we've got to factor in. Now, I do think game keycards also will play a role. I think a lot of people are skeptical because of the game keycards, and obviously game keycards not being really good physical media. But let me know what you guys think. I'm not sure, if Switch 2 ever outsold the Switch 1. I'm going to lean with no as of right now, because obviously I do think there is quite a sort of ceiling for the Switch 2 when it comes to obviously comparing to Switch 1, because Switch 1 is obviously the second best selling console of all time. It's got 156 million consoles sold. It's quite a large margin to beat, and the Switch 2 is not as much of a new surprise as the Switch was originally. So I'm skeptical. I do hope that we can see the Switch 2 continue to be successful, but I doubt it will ever outsell the Switch 2. If you agree with me, let me know in the comments. If you disagree with me, let me know in the comments. Let's have a nice discussion. If you're new, make sure you subscribe and you let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you're new, make sure you subscribe and join EC, as we're trying to build a billion subscribers. Any help is greatly appreciated. We will eventually overthrow Mr. Beast. So let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.